Hello everyone. Okay, so let's look at decision structures. Okay, so decision structures are basically structures in programming that allow us to write our programs in such a way that one thing is done or something is done if a certain condition is true, and another thing is done if the condition is false. So basically it allows us to write our programs in such a way that our program does different things based on if a certain condition is true or false. Okay, so there are several kinds or different types of decision structures, but in this video, we're going to look at one of them, which is called an if statement. Right? So this is how it's this is the syntax. This is how it's written. You start with an if clause, okay, and then a certain condition. Now these conditions are programming statements, regular programming statements, but they have to result to true or false, right? These expressions, okay, that results to true or false are called Boolean expressions. And the way we form these Boolean expressions is with what's called relational operators. So an example will be something like 2 is greater than 3. This statement has to result to true or false. And an example of a relational operator will be the greater than sign. Now there are several relational operators. We're going to look at all of them and in examples, but this is basically how the if statement works. You start with your if clause, your Boolean expression, that's a programming statement that has to result to true or false. That's why it's called Boolean. And then you end it with a colon, and then you indent. Okay, you indent one level. You make sure you indent. Make sure that the statements, what we're about to type right now is the statements that happens if this condition is true. All right, the if statement works in such a way that if this condition is true, something happens. If it's false, nothing happens. There are other decision structures that allow us to do something if a certain condition is true, and there are, and then do another thing if a certain condition is false. But we are looking at in particular an if statement. We'll look at the other ones, but an if statement works in such a way that if this condition is true, something happens. If it's false, nothing happens. Because all we are doing is writing an if statement to do something, to do one thing if the condition is true. That's all we care about. So if this condition is true, we have to type what happens. We have to tell the program what happens. And that's where we type it here. But we have to make sure that our statements are indented. Okay, we'll talk more about this. But make sure your statements are indented. What you want to happen should be indented. They shouldn't be on the same line with this if clause. You indent it and then you start typing here. So if 2 is greater than 3, then we print a message. Let's print out a message and say that 2 is greater than 3. Right? So, something like this. So when I run the program, nothing happens because we said if 2 is greater than 3, then print out this. But because 2 is not greater than 3, nothing happened. That's how an if statement works. An if clause, your condition, what you want to happen when the condition is true. Because this condition is not true, because this Boolean expression, which we'll talk more about in the future, because this Boolean expression is not true, this statement didn't run. Now let's change it to 3 is greater than 2. Oops, 3 is greater than 2. Now we know this statement is true, so we are expecting this statement here to run. So when I run the program, we see 2 is greater than, oops, I need to change the message. Yeah, let's change it to 3 is greater than 2. All right, so when I run the program, we see 3 is greater than 2. That's because when this Boolean expression, was evaluated, it resulted to true, okay? And if it's true, then this statement executes or runs. All right, so we can do something like, let's create a variable and let's call it first number. Let's set it equal to 3, and then second number, let's set it equal to 2. So when we can do something like if first number is greater than second number, typing is bad. Then we can use the values of the variables, okay, directly. Okay, we can use the variables directly in this statement and say, okay, so I'm going to pass them separately into this print function. By default, when you pass in multiple arguments into this print function, by default, they are displayed with a space separating each of these arguments. So I'm going to type in, if that's the case, if first number is greater than second number, then let's display a message saying first number, that's our first argument. Our second argument is going to be a string. We're going to say is greater than. Then our third argument is going to be second number. So by default, when you pass arguments into the print function, they are displayed with a space separating them. right, so if 3 is greater than 2, right, if first number is equal to second number, then let's display a message saying whatever the value of first number is greater than whatever the value of second number is. So run the program and we see 3 is greater than 2. Let's change the value of these to, let's say, 4 and then 10, right? The only time that we see this print statement is when first number is greater than second number. First number is 4, second number is 10. So when we run the program, nothing happens because first number, which is 4, is not greater than second number. The if statement only works when this condition results in true. Let's change this to 10 and then let's say 5. First number is 10, second number is 5. The only time we see this print statement is when first number, which is 10, is greater than 5. And that's true. If this results to true, is when this results to true. If this results to true, then we see this print statement. So run the program and it says 10 is greater than 5. So an if statement only executes whatever statements you type here if the condition is true. If the condition is not true, nothing happens. That's how the if statement works. You type your condition, first start with an if clause, type your condition, colon here. Make sure your statements are indented. We'll talk more about this, but make sure they're indented. Make sure whatever happens when your condition is true, make sure those statements are not in line. Make sure they are not in line this way. Make sure they're indented at least one level in, right? And we'll talk more about that. If you have multiple statements, if you want multiple things to happen, for example, if you want to print another statement like end of program, for example, right? So you display the message and display end of program. Make sure all these statements are in line. Okay, make sure they're in line. And if you, for example, start with 3 spaces, make sure they're consistent. Make sure they're all in line, consistent. All right. Don't let this be indented 4 spaces deep, and don't let this be indented, let's say, like this. Right. Make sure all your statements that should execute when your condition is true are all in line this way. Right. We'll talk more about indentation, but this is basically how an if statement works, and we'll talk more about relational operators in the future, and more about the Boolean expressions. Okay, we'll see multiple examples. So, but I wanted you to have an example, an idea of how an if statement works. All right. So if you have any questions, please comment down below, and I'll do everything to respond to them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time with the next video. All right then. Bye bye.